It was supposed to be just another weekend getaway, a break from the chaos of city life. Four close friends, Tom, Sarah, Mark, and Lucy, decided to leave the noise and stress behind and escape into the serene embrace of nature. They had been planning this trip for months, hoping to unwind and make some unforgettable memories. But little did they know, this would be a weekend they'd never forget, for reasons far darker than they could ever have imagined. Tom, the leader of the group, was always the one to organize their adventures. His love for the outdoors and thrill-seeking spirit made him the perfect choice to lead them into the wilderness. Then there was Sarah, sharp, logical, and always level-headed. She had an eye for detail and often played the role of the voice of reason, but even she wasn't immune to the eerie pull of the forest. Mark, on the other hand, was quiet, often keeping to himself. A deep thinker, but also the most cautious of the group. He was never fully at ease when it came to venturing off the beaten path. And then there was Lucy, the curious one. Always seeking the unknown, she was the first to suggest exploring the old abandoned cabin deep in the woods. It was her sense of adventure that would soon lead them into something far more terrifying than they could ever anticipate. The sun was setting as they set up camp near a remote area in the woods, the very place where legends and whispers of a haunted cabin lay dormant. None of them realized that the forest they entered wasn't just filled with trees. It held secrets waiting to be uncovered, and they were about to awaken something they'd never be able to escape. The decision to camp near the abandoned cabin wasn't entirely random. As the group of friends scrolled through the maps, trying to find a place far from the city, Tom stumbled upon a secluded spot deep in the woods, miles away from any civilization. It seemed perfect, isolated, quiet, and untouched. But there was one catch: the old cabin nearby. According to local legend, the cabin had been empty for decades. Yet, the whispers of the town's elderly residents were enough to raise suspicion. They warned Tom and his friends to steer clear of it. "That place is cursed," one old man had said. "No one who stayed there has ever come back the same. Some don't come back at all." Despite the warnings, curiosity got the best of the group. Sarah, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off as superstitious nonsense, but even she couldn't deny the odd sense of unease she felt when looking at the cabin on the map. The legend surrounding the cabin was dark. It was said to be haunted by the restless spirits of its former occupants, people who had met gruesome ends under mysterious circumstances. The locals spoke in hushed tones, suggesting the cabin had once been home to a family who vanished without a trace, their disappearance linked to unspeakable rituals that still echoed in the walls. Yet, the more they heard, the more intrigued they became. It wasn't just the thrill of camping in the wild, it was the allure of the unknown. And so, with a mix of excitement and caution, they made their way to that very spot, unaware that they were walking straight into a nightmare. The afternoon began just like any other camping trip. The sun was still high in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the dense forest. The group of friends unloaded their gear, laughter echoing through the trees as they set up their campsite. The air was crisp and fresh, the kind of clean air you could only find miles away from the hustle and bustle of the city. For a moment, it felt like the world was a peaceful place, free from stress, from noise, from everything that usually weighed them down. Tom was in charge of the fire, expertly arranging the logs and striking a match to get the flames going. Sarah, ever the planner, had organized the food, her cheerful voice suggesting recipes and perfecting the menu for the night. Mark, always the quiet one, wandered around the campsite, keeping an eye out for anything out of the ordinary. He was usually the one most reluctant to explore, but today, he seemed more relaxed than usual. And Lucy, with her trademark curiosity, couldn't help but glance towards the edge of the forest, her thoughts lingering on the cabin they had been warned about. They shared stories, roasted marshmallows, and cracked jokes as the shadows grew longer. The sound of the fire crackling was the only noise, and the occasional chirp of a bird, distant and peaceful. Nothing felt out of place. In that moment, it was easy to forget the unsettling warnings of the locals. To them, everything seemed normal, but deep down, something lingered in the air, a quiet, unspoken tension. The forest around them felt too still, almost too silent, as if it was holding its breath. For now, though, they were content. Little did they know, their calm evening was about to take a dark turn. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the warmth of the day slowly faded, leaving behind the chilling embrace of the night. The forest around them grew silent, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the cool breeze. The fire crackled softly, casting eerie shadows on the ground. At first, everything seemed peaceful, normal even. But then, as the darkness deepened, the sounds started. It began with a faint, eerie creak. At first, it was barely noticeable, almost like the wind brushing against the old wooden walls of the cabin. But then it came again, louder this time. The unmistakable sound of a door groaning open, as if something or someone was pushing it. The wind, however, hadn't picked up. It was still, unnervingly still. Then, the footsteps, soft at first, a subtle tapping sound that echoed in the distance, just beyond the crackling of their fire. Mark was the first to notice. His eyes darted towards the cabin, his face pale in the flickering light. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. The others paused, listening intently. Another creak, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Footsteps that didn't belong to any of them. Sarah, ever the rational one, brushed it off. "It's probably just the wind or animals. There's no need to panic," she said, trying to calm the growing unease. But Mark wasn't so easily convinced. "No," he insisted, his voice rising with each word. "That wasn't the wind. That came from the cabin. I don't think we should be here." Despite his growing fear, Tom and Lucy were more intrigued than frightened. Tom, ever the adventurer, shrugged it off. "It's probably nothing. Maybe someone's just living out there, or it's an old creaky building." Lucy, with her curiosity getting the best of her, suggested we should check it out. "It's just the beginning of the night. Let's see what's really going on." Mark's anxiety mounted, and he insisted they leave. But Tom and Lucy were determined to push forward. A sense of unease hung in the air, but their decision was made. They were too deep into the night now. Little did they know, the footsteps they heard were only the beginning of something far darker, something that would follow them long after they left the fire behind. The night was growing colder, the tension palpable as the group of friends stood, frozen in the flickering light of their campfire. The strange sounds had stopped for a moment, but something else had taken their place. Sarah, who had tried to dismiss the event so far, squinted into the darkened cabin. In the dim light, she thought she saw something moving inside. A shadow? A figure? She wasn't sure, but it was enough to make her heart race. "Did you see that?" she whispered, nudging Tom. The others turned to her, their faces uncertain. It was hard to make out what she had seen, but there was definitely something that didn't belong. Without waiting for a response, Sarah stepped forward, her curiosity overriding her sense of caution. "I'm going to check it out," she said, her voice unsteady. Tom and Lucy followed, despite the unease tightening in their chests. Mark, however, hesitated, his gut telling him this was a bad idea. He lingered by the fire, eyes darting nervously toward the cabin. As they approached the cabin, the forest around them seemed unnaturally silent. The sound of their footsteps felt like an intrusion into the heavy stillness. The moonlight barely illuminated the path ahead, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. The closer they got, the more the temperature dropped. The air was thick with an oppressive cold, unlike anything they had felt earlier that evening. And then it happened. With no warning, the cabin door swung open, creaking loudly as it was pushed back. But there was no one there. No wind, no movement. Just the door, wide open, as though inviting them in. The chill intensified, biting at their skin as if the very air had turned to ice. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the trees, strong enough to extinguish their campfire in an instant, plunging them into complete darkness. Panic swept over the group, their breaths shallow and quick. The cold wasn't just in the air, it seemed to be emanating from the cabin itself, something ancient and unnatural. Standing in the darkness, they felt the weight of something watching them. A presence that wasn't just an idea or a shadow, it was real, and it was waiting. The night stretched on, each passing moment heavier than the last. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant snap of a branch. But as the hours dragged, something darker began to settle over the group, something far worse than they had imagined. It started with a sound. At first, it was soft, almost like a whisper on the wind, a strange, low giggle. It was unsettling, but they tried to ignore it, telling themselves it was just the wind playing tricks, maybe an animal in the distance. But then it came again, clearer this time. A laugh, high-pitched and mocking, echoing from inside the cabin, the kind of laugh that no human should be able to make, especially not at this hour. Mark stiffened, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that? That wasn't normal," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But the others didn't respond. Sarah and Tom stood still, frozen in place. Lucy, however, was trembling, but couldn't tear her gaze away from the cabin. It was like a magnetic pull, an invisible force urging her to go closer. Before anyone could stop her, Lucy stepped forward, her legs heavy with fear but unable to resist. "I need to see what's inside," she muttered, almost to herself. She walked cautiously toward the cabin, her steps slow, as though the earth beneath her was growing more reluctant to let her move. When she reached the window, her breath caught in her throat. There, standing just inside the cabin, was a shadow, a figure. Its shape was faint, flickering in and out of view like a malfunctioning television. But it was there, unmistakable, a figure just behind the glass, watching them. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its eyes, if it even had eyes, fixed on her, waiting for the right moment to step forward. Her heart pounded in her chest. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something alive, something waiting. Something that was going to come out, whether she was ready for it or not. Lucy backed away, stumbling in fear. "We need to leave. Now," she whispered, but the weight of the night had already sunk in. The presence was no longer something they could ignore. They were being watched by something that wasn't human, something that had been waiting for them. The night was thick with the sounds of the forest, but it was not the usual peaceful symphony of nature. This night was different. The air felt heavier, as if something was pressing in on them from all sides. As they huddled together in their tent, trying to ignore the creeping dread that had settled over them, the silence was shattered by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. At first, it was subtle, a soft tapping on the earth. But the sound grew louder with each passing moment, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking toward them with purpose. Tom's eyes snapped open, his pulse quickening as the footsteps drew nearer. The others were awake now, listening intently, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound wasn't distant. It was right outside their tent, just beyond the thin walls of fabric. Then the shape appeared. A figure emerged from the darkness, barely visible in the dim light of the campfire. But there was no mistaking what they saw. A man, hunched over, his clothes ragged and torn, covered in dark, drying blood. His face was unrecognizable, streaked with dirt and blood, but the haunting emptiness in his eyes was clear. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound except for the scraping of his bare feet against the ground. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he moved toward the group, his gaze never leaving them, his movements unnatural, as though he was struggling to remain tethered to the world of the living. Frozen in fear, they could only watch as the man approached. The air grew colder, colder than anything they had ever felt, and the fire flickered violently, casting long shadows on the trees. The man stopped just a few feet away from their tent, his hollow eyes staring straight through them. There was no malice in his gaze, no anger, just an emptiness that chilled them to their very core. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the figure turned and faded into the night, disappearing into the forest as though swallowed by the very shadows themselves. The group didn't speak for a long time, but their thoughts were all the same. That was no man. That was no human. Whatever that thing was, it had been walking with them, watching them, waiting for something. And it wasn't finished yet. In the grip of panic, Sarah found herself stumbling through the dimly lit interior of the cabin, her hands trembling as she rifled through the forgotten remnants of the past. The air inside was musty, the walls thick with the weight of time. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. Her eyes scanned the cluttered space, and that's when she found it. A dusty, leather-bound journal, half hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers and broken furniture. With shaky hands, Sarah opened the journal, the pages yellowed with age. The writing was uneven, hurried, as if the person who had written it was desperate to leave behind a record of what had happened. The name at the top of the first page caught her attention. As she read, the eerie story of Samuel's life and death unfolded before her. Samuel had once lived in this very cabin over 50 years ago, a man known in the nearby town for his strange, isolated existence. According to the journal, Samuel was a quiet, reclusive man who kept to himself, rarely interacting with the local townspeople. But there were rumors, whispers of a troubled past. It was said that he had been involved in a mysterious and violent event that no one fully understood. Some claimed he had been part of a cult, others said it was a tragic love affair gone wrong. But whatever the truth was, it ended in bloodshed. Samuel was found dead, his body torn and lifeless, with no clear explanation as to how or why. The townspeople had always believed that Samuel's death wasn't natural. The journal hinted at something darker, something sinister. Samuel's soul had never found peace, and it was said that his spirit still haunted the woods around the cabin, trapped in a never-ending loop of torment and rage. As Sarah read the final entry, her breath caught in her throat. The last few words were chilling. He's still here. He waits for those who dare disturb his home. A cold chill ran down Sarah's spine. She turned toward the others, but it was already too late. The presence she had felt earlier, the one that had been watching them, was no longer a distant feeling. It was closing in, and they were trapped in Samuel's world now. The group of friends had made up their minds. They were leaving. The terror they had experienced, the overwhelming feeling of being watched, was too much to ignore any longer. They packed their things in a hurry, their hands shaking, eyes darting nervously toward the now closed cabin. The haunting presence that had lingered around them, that inexplicable chill in the air, was suffocating. As they walked away, they could feel the weight of the forest pressing in on them, the trees seeming to whisper behind their backs. But it wasn't until they turned one last time to glance at the cabin that they noticed something odd, something impossible. The door, which had swung open earlier that night, was now tightly shut. No wind, no movement, nothing could explain why it had closed. The cabin was locked tight as if it had never been disturbed. But what struck them even more was the shape in the window, the shadow of a man standing still, watching them. His eyes, cold, empty, and filled with malice, stared out at them through the grimy glass. They knew it was him, the man from the cabin, Samuel. His presence felt like a weight on their chests, suffocating them with each passing second. Without a word, they hurried down the path, hearts pounding. But the feeling of being watched never left them. It was as though the forest itself was closing in on them, as if Samuel's spirit had followed them, clinging to the edges of their minds. The days that followed were no better. Each of them, back in their own homes, tried to move on, but they couldn't escape the feeling of unease. The nightmares started almost immediately. Vivid, terrifying dreams of being trapped in that same cabin, being chased by the shadow of Samuel. Every sound in the night seemed amplified. Every creak of the floorboards felt like someone was walking behind them. And then, it happened. The shadow of the man appeared again, in the corner of their eyes, in reflections of windows, even in their own mirrors. They couldn't run from him, couldn't hide. No matter how far they went, Samuel's presence lingered, always just out of reach, but never truly gone. The terror they had experienced in the forest had followed them home, and they soon realized, with growing dread, that some spirits were not so easily left behind. As I wrap up this chilling tale, I want to leave you with one important reminder. There are places in this world, hidden deep within forests, long abandoned and shrouded in mystery, that are better left untouched. The kind of places that, on the surface, seem like a harmless adventure, places that whisper to the curious, urging them to come closer, to explore the unknown. But what many fail to realize is that sometimes those places aren't just abandoned buildings or forgotten landmarks. They are the resting places of spirits who were never meant to be disturbed, their souls trapped, restless, and waiting for the wrong person to come along and wake them from their eternal slumber. The cabin in the woods, the one we just visited in this story, is one of those places. For years it sat empty, its secrets buried in the walls, its dark history forgotten by all but the oldest of locals. But to the curious, the thrill of exploring the unknown is too tempting to resist. And when they do, when they step into the quiet, decaying space, thinking it's just another forgotten relic of the past, they disturb something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. The truth is, not all curiosity should be satisfied. Some doors should remain closed. Some paths should never be walked. Because in this world, there are still those spirits that linger in the shadows, waiting for someone to wander into their domain. And once you've disturbed them, once you've broken the silence they've waited so long to keep, you may find that they don't let go so easily. So let this serve as a warning. There are places you shouldn't go, and there are things you should never try to uncover. Some stories aren't meant to be told, and some spirits aren't ready to rest. Stay safe, and remember, sometimes curiosity can come at a far greater cost than you ever expected. Thank you all for taking the time to listen to today's ghost story. See you in the next, even more thrilling stories. If possible, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel to support me in creating more ghost stories for you. Thank you so much. Goodbye, and see you again.